Live from our nation's capital, it's Deadline DC with Brad Bannon.
Hi, I'm Brad Bannon, the host of Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. No one else would take the job, apparently. uh, uh, we have a great show for you today. We're going to get to our guest in a minute. But for those of you who don't regularly watch Deadline DC, I'm Brad Bannon. I'm a national Democratic strategist, a columnist for The Hill in Washington, D.C., and a political analyst for news radio stations KNX in Los Angeles and WGN in Chicago. My company, Bannon Communications Research, polls for progressive issue groups, labor unions, and Democrats. If you have any ideas or suggestions for Deadline DC, or if you want to learn more about my polling firm, Bannon Communications Research, you can reach me on Twitter at Brad Bannon. This week on Deadline DC, our guest in the first half hour is Mike Lux, who's here to discuss a new report he co-authored on the dramatic decline of Democratic dominance in small factory towns. Then in the second half hour, we will, as we usually do, have our provocative progressive political panel. Joining us on the panel today is Edwith Theogene from Generation Progress and our own executive producer and progressive activist, Mark Grimaldi. In the first though, we have a little music clip. That, of course, is Allentown with a big song, and sort of speaks to the topic of our first discussion today. In this segment, Mike Lux joins us. Mike is the co-founder of Democracy Partners. He's here today to discuss a new report he co-wrote on voting trends in counties with small factory towns. Mike, welcome to Deadline DC. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Brad. I really appreciate you putting me on.
First of all, why don't you give our viewers and listeners a brief synopsis of your report?
So what our report laid out was that if you look in the sort of classic industrial heartland, the Midwest and places like Pennsylvania and Western New York, Democrats have done better in big cities, have done better in the suburbs in the last 10 years, but we are getting killed in small and medium-sized towns where there's a large manufacturing presence. We looked at several different kinds of counties in our report. We looked at college towns. We looked at what we called agricultural counties, where there wasn't really any big factories, but it was really mostly rural. We looked at the suburbs. We looked at the big cities. What we found is that if you're a town that had a big manufacturing presence, had a big factory over the last 20 years, a lot of those places used to be Democratic. Used to lean Democrat, or in some cases be heavily Democratic, and now have shifted more and more toward Trump republicanism. These are places that went for Donald Trump that literally have never gone Republican before. These are places that are feeling forgotten and deserted, really, by the National Democratic Party, and it's heartbreaking to me. I'm a Midwesterner myself, and I was with the AFL-CIO in Iowa and did other jobs in Iowa, and towns that used to be very Democratic towns like Ottumwa Iowa, or Burlington, or Sioux City, Dubuque. Those places all went for Trump this time. Not only this time, but 2016 as well. Towns like Youngstown in Ohio, Flint, Michigan, all these kind of mid-sized and smaller factory towns throughout the Midwest have moved heavily Republican, because the folks in those towns don't believe the Democratic Party represents them anymore. When I was in Iowa working for the labor movement in the 1980s and 90s, early 90s, these kinds of towns were the most Democratic counties in the state, and now they're going for Trump. And to me, that's heartbreaking. It's something that has to change.
Okay, well, if voters in these small factory towns don't think the Democratic Party represents them anymore, who do they think the Democratic Party represents?
They think, and of course, a lot of this is the disinformation and misinformation of social media and of Fox News, but they think the Democratic Party represents wealthy elites. They think the party sold them out on trade to help big business. They think the party sold them out during the financial crisis, let Wall Street off the hook, and they believe that the party now no longer represents working people the way it used to.
Okay, let me ask you this question. 2016 is one thing, but now voters in these small factory towns that we're discussing have had 5 years to look at Trump and Trumpism and its after effects. Have they come to feel that Republicans represent their interests more than Democrats, or are they just pissed off at Democrats and haven't got there yet about Republicans?
Well, it's right now, I would say it's contested space. The worst election for us, not surprisingly, was 2016, and they sort of thought of the Clintons as sort of the ultimate folks who had been for NAFTA, who had been for some of these big trade deals, who'd been for deregulating Wall Street, and so there was a lot of bitterness about that. In 2020 and in 2018, actually, and 2020, we started to come back in these towns, but there is such a cycle of disinformation, misinformation. The right wing has created this media bubble in these places, and they don't get much other news, and so there's still a perception that the Democrats are the party of elites, and that the Republicans, like Trump, care about them. I think that the good news is that, as I said, we started to come back in some of those places. For example, Joe Biden. Hillary Clinton had lost Erie, Pennsylvania, and Scranton, and other towns like that. Joe Biden came back and won some of those places. He got just enough better in a lot of those towns to come back and win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and to hold on in Minnesota, where Hillary almost lost. So he did a little bit better in those places, which is why I say they're very much contested ground, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to put a focus on these places. My view is the Democratic Party tends to think that all the swing voters live in the suburbs, but I think a surprising number of them live in towns precisely like the ones that we study.
Okay. Our guest in this half hour is Mike Lux, who is a co-founder of Democracy Partners. Also, he's the co-author of a new study on the decline of Democratic dominance in small factory towns. We're going to go to a break so we can get things rolling again. But when we come back from break, we'll have more of Mike Lux. I think we're going to discuss the impact of Build Back Better on whether that is playing well or poorly with voters in these small factory towns. But anyway, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with our TV listeners. We'll be back in a couple of minutes for our radio listeners. So don't go anywhere. Our guest in this half hour is Mike Lux, who is the co-author of a new report on the decline of the Democratic vote in small factory towns, in counties with small factory towns. Mike, let me ask you this. When we were finishing the last segment, you were talking about suburban voters. And I would guess from just my conversations with people in Washington that Democrats are fixated with the battle of the suburbs. And really, I've not heard much discussion, unfortunately, until I saw your report last week about the importance of voters who live in counties with small factory towns. What's it going to take for Democrats to change their mindsets?
Well, I hopefully reports like mine will have an impact on that. I'm starting a new project that is really going to focus in on these counties, and we're going to be literally going out to all these states and doing meetings with organizations, with some of the best local organizers, people who've been involved in previous campaigns in these states, to really talk about what's going to make a difference in these counties in the years to come. I do also think, when I look at the Biden team, the Build Back Better agenda, there's a lot of it that is very focused on these kinds of counties, which is making me hopeful. Now we still have to pass it, we still have to sell it, to tell people what was in it. But there's a lot of the policy investments, a lot of the things in that package are going to help, I think, in these small towns. But you're absolutely right in terms of how DC folks think. DC folks think, well, the Democrats are in big cities, the Republicans are in rural areas, and the suburbs are everything that matters. But I think if you look at a lot of the classic battleground states, in the industrial heartland, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Ohio. Those are places where these voters are actually, in some cases, more than half of the vote. The factory town voters that we studied are, in some cases, more than half of the vote. In other cases, in the 40s. There's not a single state that we studied where those voters were not at least 43% of the electorate. And in some places, they're more like 54, 55, 56% of the electorate. So this is a huge share of voters that the Democratic Party has not been paying much attention to.
Okay. We're going to take another quick break here so we can bring back our radio listeners. Stay tuned. When we come back from the short break, we will have more of Mike Lux, who's here to talk about a report he co-authored on the importance of the Democratic vote in counties with small factory towns. So we'll be right back after these messages. So please don't go anywhere. You'll be kicking yourself all day if you do. Welcome back to Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. For our radio listeners, if you like to watch the show every Monday, in addition to listen to it, there are all sorts of ways you can do that. You can watch us on Twitter at twitter.com/Brad Bannon. You can watch us also on Facebook at tinyurl.com/Brad BB Facebook Live. And you can also watch us on YouTube at tinyurl.com, Brad on YouTube. So if you would love to see us in addition to listening to us, now you have all sorts of options to do so. Our guest again in this segment is Mike Lux, who is the co-author of a report on the dramatic decline of the Democratic vote in small and counties with small factory towns. Let me ask a question. And again, we talked about the Democratic preoccupation with the suburbs. Another Democratic preoccupation, I think, among some insiders, is the feeling that Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan is an overreach, and the federal government is just trying to do too much. Are these voters in small factory towns, do they welcome Build Back Better, or they think that the federal, Joe Biden is just trying to do too much, too fast, too soon?
I think overall they welcome it. The polling is complicated with these voters. These tend to be swing voters, and so you're not going to have them suddenly embrace everything the Democrats do. And they do, when Republicans pound messages about, oh, this is just going to be tax and spend, higher taxes, it's too much, it's too fast. These voters are susceptible to those arguments. But if you ask them what they want done, when you ask them what their opinion is of the policies in Build Back Better, they're actually overwhelmingly supportive. They want to tax the rich, for one thing. They believe in taxing the rich, and arguments about why we shouldn't tax the rich actually make them more angry. In fact, the polling shows that if people know that that Build Back Better is paid for primarily by taxing millionaires and billionaires, the support for it actually shoots up dramatically.
Okay, that's a good question. Do they know that, though? Do they know that, all I hear when people discuss Build Back Better is $3.5 trillion. And as the Biden administration has made the point several times, basically it doesn't cost $3.5 trillion because the entire thing would be paid for by tax increases on on wealthy Americans, making corporations pay their fair share of taxes. Has the message got out to voters in these small factory towns?
Not should have. I think that there is definitely a gap between the policies and the communication about the policies, and that's a big concern. Democrats need to figure out a communications infrastructure. They have to figure out a way to get the message out beyond what they've done, because, like I say, the individual policies are popular. Childcare is really popular. More money for education is really popular. The child tax credit is really popular. Green jobs are really popular. But people don't know, to your point, voters in these factory towns, for one thing, the newspaper industry, for a variety of reasons, has mostly gone away. The newspapers in these towns are awful.
If they exist at all.
If they exist at all, and the radio stations are mostly right-wing talk show stations. The ones that have any news or issues on them at all. They get a lot of their information from goofy memes that their friends send them on Facebook. So, and a lot of that is driven by the right-wing communications infrastructure. So people are not getting the message very well, and that's a problem that the party has to figure out how to change. Because if we can get the word out about these policies, win these voters back.
Okay, let me ask you another question. From a message point of view, what should the Democratic message and accompanying policies be like to bring back these voters in these counties with small factory towns?
I think there's a couple of things. One is on the issue agenda, talking about things that people in these towns clearly do care about. Like I said, there's a lot in these bills, policy-wise, that people are going to like. And so that's one piece of it. But I also think there is a cultural thing that's going on as well. These folks feel like they've been forgotten, they've been ignored, they've been abandoned. There's a real sense that quote unquote the libs, i.e. the Democratic Party, don't get their lives, don't understand their lives. So I think part of it is having candidates and having organizations that talk to people in plain language that is easy for them to understand, that talks about things that they care about, and doesn't condescend. I mean, to me, that's the biggest single part of it, is that people don't want to be condescended to, and they sometimes felt that way with Hillary Clinton or with Barack Obama. I think they feel that way less with Joe Biden.
Small town President Joe.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's touching the right cultural chords, as well as the issue chords, is really important.
Okay. And can you talk about specific policy areas that Democrats should emphasize to appeal to these voters?
Well, I think one thing is raising the minimum wage.
Okay.
A lot of these voters are in that range, that $10 to $12 range, sometimes less. I think another thing, I mean, a lot of these voters used to be union members. And in fact, one of the things we document in the study is that the towns where there've been a big loss of union jobs are some of the worst towns in terms of losing Democratic votes. But if we can help rebuild the labor movement, and get those folks jobs back and have them be union jobs, it will matter a great deal to people. So that's another big one. As I said, childcare really matters. Almost all of these families, both parents work.
Yep.
Because they have to.
Yep.
The wages aren't good. The price of everything is going up, and they need to be both working jobs. So childcare is actually huge, and if we were able to provide that more in these smaller towns and mid-sized towns, and not just in big cities, that would matter enormously.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much for joining us today on Deadline DC with Brad Bannon. I read your report, all 82 pages of it, and I hope influential Democrats in Washington and around the country do the same thing.